Section 16, page 71. Chapter 12. Old-fashioned New York dined at 7, and the habit of after-dinner calls, though derided in Archer's set, still generally prevailed. As the young man strolled up Fifth Avenue from Waverly Place, the long thoroughfare was deserted but for a group of carriages standing before the Reggie Chiverses, where there was a dinner for the Duke, and the occasional figure of an elderly gentleman in heavy overcoat and muffler ascending a brownstone doorstep and disappearing into a gaslit hall. Thus, as Archer crossed Washington Square, he remarked that old Mr. Dulac was calling on his cousins, the Dagonets, and turning down the corner of West 10th Street, he saw Mr. Skipworth, of his own firm, obviously bound on a visit to the Miss Lennings. A little farther up Fifth Avenue, Beaufort appeared on his doorstep, darkly projected against a blaze of light, descended to his private brougham, and rolled away to a mysterious and probably unmentionable destination. It wasn't an opera night, and no one was giving a party, so that Beaufort's outing was undoubtedly of a clandestine nature. Archer connected it in his mind with a little house beyond Lexington Avenue, in which very-bound window curtains and flower boxes had recently appeared, and before whose newly painted door the canary-colored brougham of Miss Fanny Ring was frequently seen to wait. Beyond the small and sleepy pyramid which composed Mrs. Archer's ward lay the almost unmapped quarter inhabited by artists, musicians, and people who wrote. These scattered fragments of humanity had never shown any desire to be amalgamated with the social structure. In spite of old days, they were said to be, for the most part, quite respectable, but they preferred to keep them themselves. Medora Manson, in her prosperous days, had inaugurated a literary saloon, but it had soon died out owing to the reluctance of the literary to frequent it. Others had made the same attempt, and there was a household of Blankers, an intense and voluble mother, and 3 blowsy daughters who imitated her, where one met Edwin Booth and Patty and William Winter, and the new Shakespearean actor George Rignaud, and some of the magazine editors and musical and literary critics. Miss Archer and her group felt a certain timidity concerning these persons. They were odd, they were uncertain. They had things one didn't know about in the background of their lives and minds. Literature and art were deeply respected in the Archer set, and Miss Archer was always at pains to tell her children how much more agreeable and cultivated society had been when it included such figures as Washington Irving, Fitz Green Halleck, and the poet of The Culprit Fay. The most celebrated authors of the generation had been gentlemen. Perhaps the unknown persons who succeeded them had gentlemanly sentiments, but their origin, their appearance, their hair, their intimacy with the stage and the opera, made in all New York criterion inapplicable to them. When I was a girl, Miss Archer used to say, we knew everybody between the Battery and Canal Street, and only the people one knew had carriages. It was perfectly easy to place any one of them. Now one can tell, and I prefer not to try. Only old Catherine Mingot, with her absence of moral prejudice and almost parvenu indifference to the solar distinctions, might have breached the abyss, but she had never opened a book or looked at a picture, and cared for music only because it reminded her of a gala nights at the Italians, in the days of her triumph at the Tuileries. Possibly Beaufort, who was her match in daring, would have succeeded in bringing about a fusion, but his grand house and silk-stocking footman were an obstacle to informal sociability. Moreover, he was an illiterate as old Miss Mingot, and considered fellows who wrote as the mere paid purveyors of rich man's pleasures, and no one rich enough to influence his opinion had ever questioned it. Newland Archer had been aware of these things ever since he could remember, and had accepted them as a part of the structure of his universe. He knew that there were societies, where painters and poets, and novelists, and men of science, and even great actors, were as sought after as dukes. He had often pictured to himself what it would have been to live in the intimacy of the rubbing rooms, dominated by the talk of Mirmir, in parentheses, whose letters a une incone was one of his inseparables, of Thackeray, Browning, or William Morris. But such things were inconceivable in New York, and unsettling to think of. Archer knew most of the fellows who wrote, the musicians and the painters. He met them at the Century, or at the little musical theatrical clubs that were beginning to come into existence. He enjoyed them and was bored with them at the Blankers, where they were mingled with fervid and dowdy women who passed them about like captured curiosities, and even after his most exciting talks with Ned Vincent, he always came away with the feeling that if his world was small, so was theirs, and that the only way to enlarge either was to reach a stage of manners where they would naturally merge. He was reminded of this by trying to picture the society in which the Countess Olenska had lived and suffered, and also, perhaps, tasted mysterious joys. He remembered with what amusement she had told him that her grandmother mingled, and the Vallons objected to her living in a Bohemian quarter, given over to people who wrote. It was not the peril but the poverty that her family disliked. But that shade escaped her, and she supposed they considered literature compromising. She herself had no fears of it, and the books scattered about her driving room, in parentheses, a part of the house in which books were usually supposed to be out of place. Though chiefly works of fiction had whetted Archer's interest with such new names as those of Paul Bourget, Huysmans, and Gaucourt brothers. Ruminating on these things as he approached her door, he was once more conscious of the curious way in which she reserved his values, and of the need of thinking himself into conditions incredibly different from any that he knew if he were to be of use in her present difficulty. Nastasia opened the door, smiling mysteriously. On the bench in the hall lay a sable-lined overcoat, a folded opera hat of dull silk with a gold GB on the lining, and a white silk muffler. There was no mistaking the fact that these costly articles were the property of Julius Beaufort. Archer was angry, so angry that he came near scribbling a word on his card, "I'm going away." Then he remembered that, in writing to Madame Olenska, he had been kept by excess of discretion from saying that he wished to see her privately. He had therefore no one but himself to blame if she had opened her door to other visitors, and he entered the drawing room with the dogged determination to make Beaufort feel himself in the way, and to outstay him. The banker stood leaning against the mantel-shelf, which was draped with an old embroidery, held in place by brass candelabra containing church candles of yellowish wax. He had thrust his chest out, supporting his shoulders against the mantel, and resting his weight on one large patent leather foot. As Archer entered, he was smiling and looking down on his hostess, who sat on a sofa placed at right angles to the chimney. A table banked with flowers formed a screen behind it, and against the orchids and azaleas, which the young man recognized as tributes from the Beaufort hothouses, Madame Alaska sat half reclined, her head propped on a hand, and her white sleeve leaving the arm beer to the elbow. It was usual for ladies who received in the evenings to wear what were called simple dinner dresses, a close-fitting armor of whalebone silk, slightly open in the neck, with lace ruffles filling in the crack, and tight sleeves with flounce uncovering just enough wrist to show an Etruscan gold bracelet or a velvet band. But Madame Alaska, heedless of tradition, was attired in a long robe of red velvet bordered about the chin and down the front with glossy black fur. Archer remembered, on his last visit to Paris, seeing a portrait by the new painter, Carolus Duran, whose pictures were the sensation of the salon, in which the lady wore one of these bold, sheet-like robes, with her chin nestling in the fur. There was something perverse and provocative in the notion of fur, worn in the evening, in a heated drawing room, and in the combination of a muffled throat and bare arms. But the effect was undeniably pleasing. Lord love us. 3 whole days at Skyter Cliff, Beaufort was saying in his loud sneering voice as Archer entered. You would better take all your furs and a hot water bottle. Why, is the house so cold? She asked, holding out her left hand to Archer in a way mysteriously suggesting that she expected him to kiss it. Nah, but the missus is, said Beaufort, nodding carelessly to the young man. But I thought her so kind. She came herself to invite me. Greeny says I must certainly go. Greeny would, of course. And I say, it's a shame you are going to miss the little oyster supper I will plan for you at Delmenico's next Sunday, with Campanini and Scalchi and a lot of jolly people. She looked doubtfully from the banker to Archer. Ah, that does tempt me. Except the other evening at Mrs. Stutter's, I've not met a single artist since I've been here. What kind of artists? I know 1 or 2 painters. Very good fellows. That I could bring to see you if you would allow me, said Archer boldly. Painters? Are there painters in New York? Asked Beaufort, in a tone implying that there could be none, since he did not buy their pictures. And Madame Alaska said to Archer, with a grave smile, that will be charming, but I was really thinking of dramatic artists, singers, actors, musicians. My husband's house was always full of them. She said the words, my husband, as if no sinister associations were connected to them, and in a tone that seemed almost to sigh over the lost lights of her married life. Archer looked at her perplexedly, wondering if it were lightness or dissimulation that enabled her to talk so easily on the past at the very moment when she was risking her reputation in order to break with it. I do think, she went on, addressing both men, that the improve adds to one's enjoyment. It's perhaps a mistake to see the same people every day. It's confoundedly dull, anyhow. New York is dying of dullness, Beaufort grumbled. And when I try to liven it up for you, you go back on me. Come, think better of it. Sunday is your last chance, for Campanini leaves next week for Baltimore and Philadelphia. And I have a private room and a stayaway, and they will sing all night for me. How delicious. May I think it over and write to you tomorrow morning? She spoke amiably, yet with the least hint of dismissal in her voice. Beaufort evidently felt it, and being unused to dismissals, stood staring at her with an obstinate line between his eyes. Why not now? It is too serious a question to decide at this late hour. Do you call it late? She returned his glance coolly. Yes, because I have still to talk business with Mr. Archer for a little while. Ah, Beaufort snapped. There was no appeal from her tone, and with a slight shrug, he recovered his composure, took her hand, which he kissed with a practiced air, and called out from the threshold, I say, Newland, if you can persuade the Countess to stop in town, of course, you are included in the supper. left the room with his heavy, important step. For a moment, Archer fancied that Mr. Letterblair must have told her of his coming, but the irrelevance of her next remark made him change his mind. You know painters, then? You live in their milieu? She asked, her eyes full of interest. Oh, not exactly. I don't know that the arts have a milieu here, any of them. They are more like a very thinly settled outskirt. But you care for such things? Immensely. When I'm in Paris or London, I never miss an exhibition. I try to keep up. She looked down at the tip of the little satin boot that peeped from her lank draperies. I used to care immensely too. My life was full of such things. But now I want to try not to. You want to try not to? Yes, I want to cast off all my old life, to become just like everybody else here. Archer reddened. You will never be like everybody else, he said. She raised her straight eyebrows a little. Ah, don't say that, if you know how I hate to be different. Her face had grown as somber as a tragic mask. She leaned forward, clasping her knee in her thin hands, and looking away from him into remote, dark distances. I want to get away from it all, she insisted. He waited a moment and cleared his throat. I know, Mr. Letterblair has told me. Ah, that's the reason I've come. He asked me to. You see, I'm in the firm. She looked slightly surprised, and then her eyes brightened. You mean you can manage it for me? I can talk to you instead of Mr. Letterblair? Oh, that will be so much easier. Her tone touched him, and his confidence grew with his self-satisfaction. He perceived that she had spoken of business to Beaufort simply to get rid of him, and to have rooted Beaufort was something of triumph. I'm here to talk about it, he repeated. She sat silent, her head still propped by the arm that rested on the back of the sofa. Her face looked pale and extinguished, as if dimmed by the rich red of her dress. She struck Archer, of a sudden, as a pathetic and even pitiful figure. Now we are coming to hard facts, he thought, conscious in himself of the same instinctive recoil that he had so often criticized in his mother and her contemporaries. How little practice he had had in dealing with unusual situations. Their very vocabulary was unfamiliar to him, and seemed to belong to fiction and the stage. In the face of what was coming, he felt as awkward and embarrassed as a boy. After a pause, Madame Alaska broke out with an unexpected vehemence. I want to be free. I want to wipe out all the past. I understand that. Her face warmed. Then you will help me? First, he hesitated. Perhaps I ought to know a little more. She seemed surprised. You know about my husband, my life with him? He made a sign of assent. Well, then, what more is there? In this country, are such things tolerated? I'm a Protestant. Our church does not forbid divorce in such cases. Certainly not. They were both silent again. And Arthur felt the spectre of Count Olenski's letter grimacing hideously between them. The letter filled only half a page, and was just what he had described it to be in speaking of it to Mr. Letterblair. The vague charge of an angry blackguard. How much truth was behind it? Only Count Olenski's wife could tell. End of the section, page 78.